The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Catherine sat by the window, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She hadn't slept properly in weeks, and the dark circles under her eyes told the story her public smile couldn't. The weight of the past months pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak she couldn't remove. William stood in the doorway, watching his wife stare into the distance. He had seen her like this before, but never for so long. The woman who had once laughed freely at his terrible jokes now seemed lost in a world of her own making. Her auburn hair, usually perfectly styled for public appearances, fell loosely around her face as she lost herself in thoughts she wouldn't share. The palace staff moved quietly through the corridors, their usual chatter reduced to whispers. Everyone could feel the change in the atmosphere. The royal household that once buzzed with energy now felt subdued, as if holding its breath for something that might never come. Catherine's phone buzzed on the table beside her, but she didn't reach for it. The constant stream of messages from well-meaning friends and family had become overwhelming. Each ping reminded her of the expectations weighing on her, the role she was expected to play, the smile she was supposed to wear. Kate. William's voice was soft as he entered the room, his footsteps careful on the hardwood floor. She turned toward him, and, for a moment, he saw a flash of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago at university. But it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the guarded expression she had worn for months. The morning light cast long shadows across the room as they sat together in silence. Outside, the world continued its relentless pace, but inside this room, time seemed suspended. William reached for her hand, surprised when she didn't pull away. Her fingers were cold, despite the warmth of the morning sun streaming through the windows. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine," Catherine finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. William felt his heart constrict as he realized this was the first time in months she had spoken honestly about how she was feeling. The pressure of public life had always been intense, but, lately, it had become suffocating. Every appearance, every smile, every wave to the crowds felt forced and artificial. Catherine had always prided herself on being genuine, but somewhere along the way, she had lost herself in the expectations of others. William studied his wife's face, seeing the pain she had been hiding so carefully. The photographers who captured her radiant smile at public events would never see this version of Catherine, the one who struggled to find joy in simple moments, who felt trapped by the golden cage of royal duty. "What do you need?" William asked, his voice filled with a tenderness that reminded Catherine why she had chosen to build a life with this man. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in weeks. His blue eyes, usually bright with humor, now reflected her own exhaustion. The question hung between them like a lifeline. What did she need? For so long, Catherine had focused on what everyone else needed from her: the palace, the press, the public. She had forgotten that she was allowed to have needs of her own. Outside the window, a gardener tended to the rose bushes, his movements slow and deliberate. Catherine watched him work, envying his simple purpose, his clear task. When had her own life become so complicated that she envied a gardener's clarity? "I need to remember who I am," she said finally, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. William nodded, understanding immediately. The woman he had married was still there, buried beneath layers of protocol and public expectation, but she was struggling to breathe. They sat in comfortable silence as the morning stretched on, both of them understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. This wasn't about royal duties or public obligations. This was about two people who loved each other, trying to find their way back to themselves and each other. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. They couldn't continue living the way they had been, pretending everything was perfect when they were both slowly drowning. Something had to change, even if it meant making choices that would shock the world. Catherine finally set down her cold tea and turned to face William fully. In her eyes, he saw a determination that had been missing for months. She was ready to fight for herself, for their marriage, for the life they actually wanted rather than the one that had been prescribed for them. "I think," she said carefully, "it's time we had a conversation that's going to change everything." The conversation that followed would later be remembered as the turning point, though at the time it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with no way back. William closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Catherine, the formal furniture suddenly feeling like barriers between them. "Do you remember," Catherine began, her voice steadier now, "when we used to talk for hours about everything and nothing? when we would laugh until our sides hurt over the smallest things. William nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. Those days felt like a lifetime ago, buried under years of royal protocol and public scrutiny. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, like sand slowly filling an hourglass. Each public appearance had chipped away a small piece of who they really were. Each staged photograph had required them to perform a version of happiness that wasn't quite real. Each carefully scripted speech had taken them further away from their authentic voices. Catherine stood and walked to the mantelpiece, her fingers tracing the edge of a family photograph. In the picture, they looked genuinely happy, William's arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something out of frame. She couldn't remember what had been so funny, but she could remember the feeling of absolute joy in that moment. "I look at this picture," she said, not turning around, "and I barely recognize us. When did we become these people who measure every word, who calculate every gesture, who smile on command?" Her voice carried a weight that made William's chest tighten with understanding. The royal life had always come with restrictions, but, lately, those restrictions had begun to feel like chains. Every decision required approval from multiple committees. Every spontaneous moment was carefully orchestrated. Even their private conversations felt monitored, as if invisible ears were always listening. William joined her at the mantelpiece, studying the same photograph. "I miss us too," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I miss the way you used to steal my jumpers, and how you'd burn toast because you were too busy reading to pay attention to the kitchen timer." Those small, ordinary moments had been their foundation. The quiet Sunday mornings when Catherine would curl up with a book while William read the newspapers. The impromptu drives through the countryside when they needed to escape the palace walls. The silly arguments about which movie to watch that would end with them falling asleep halfway through whatever they had chosen. "The children notice," Catherine said quietly, and William felt his heart skip. This was what hurt the most, the knowledge that their struggle was affecting George, Charlotte, and Louis. Children were perceptive in ways adults often forgot, and their three had begun asking questions that were difficult to answer. George, at 11, had started asking why his mother seemed sad, even when she was smiling. Charlotte, ever observant, had commented that her parents looked like they were acting in a play when they appeared together in public. And little Louis, with the honesty of a 6-year-old, had asked if Mummy and Daddy still liked each other. The questions had hit Catherine like physical blows. She had worked so hard to shield her children from the pressures of royal life. But she was beginning to realize that her own struggle was teaching them that love meant performance, that family meant duty above all else. "They deserve to see what real love looks like," William said, reading her thoughts. "Not this careful choreography we've been performing." He was right, and they both knew it. Their children needed to see parents who chose each other every day, not parents who stayed together because protocol demanded it. The weight of their realization settled over them like a heavy blanket. They had been so focused on fulfilling their roles that they had forgotten to nurture the relationship that was supposed to be at the center of it all. The foundation of their family had been slowly eroding while they performed happiness for the cameras. Catherine turned from the photograph and faced William directly. "I want to take a break," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "From all of it. The appearances, the speeches, the constant performance. I want to remember what it feels like to be just Catherine, not the Duchess who always has to say the right thing." The request hung between them like a bridge over troubled water. William understood immediately what she was asking for, and how impossible it might be to achieve. The royal schedule was planned months, sometimes years in advance. There were commitments, expectations, traditions that couldn't simply be abandoned. But, as he looked at his wife, really looked at her, William realized that no tradition was worth losing the woman he loved. No duty was more important than the family they had created together. The institution would survive their absence, but their marriage might not survive their continued presence in roles that were slowly destroying them. "What would that look like?" he asked carefully, and Catherine felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. He wasn't dismissing her request or explaining why it was impossible. He was asking how they could make it work. "I want to take the children somewhere quiet," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Somewhere we can just be a family without photographers hiding in the bushes or staff members analyzing our every move. I want to cook dinner and help with homework and argue about bedtimes like normal parents." The word normal carried so much weight. They had never been normal, and they never would be, but perhaps they could find a version of normal that worked for them. Perhaps they could create space in their extraordinary lives for ordinary moments. William reached for her hands, and this time she didn't hesitate to take his. The palace won't understand, he said, but his tone suggested he was willing to face that battle. There will be consequences, criticism, questions we can't answer publicly. Catherine nodded, understanding the cost of what she was asking. I know, but I also know that if we don't do something now, we might lose each other entirely. And I can't live with that possibility. The silence that followed was different from the heavy quiet of the morning. This silence was full of possibility, of hope, of two people rediscovering their courage to choose love over duty. They stood together by the window, watching the world outside continue its oblivious pace, knowing that their world was about to change dramatically. How long? William asked, and Catherine felt relief flood through her. He wasn't asking if they should do this. He was asking for the practical details, ready to make it happen. Long enough, she replied, to remember who we are when nobody's watching. The conversation with the palace officials went exactly as William and Catherine had expected, which is to say, it went terribly. Private Secretary James Morrison sat across from them in the formal meeting room, his face a mask of professional concern that barely concealed his horror at their request. This is unprecedented, Morrison said for the third time, adjusting his glasses and shuffling through papers that contained detailed schedules stretching months into the future. The Duchess has commitments to 17 charitable organizations, for state dinners, and the upcoming Commonwealth tour. These obligations cannot simply be postponed. Catherine sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but William could see the tension in her shoulders. Every word Morrison spoke felt like another link in the chain that had been binding her. She had heard these arguments before: duty, obligation, tradition, expectation. They were the words that had been slowly suffocating her authentic self. What would be unprecedented, William said quietly, would be continuing on this path until my wife has a complete breakdown. I won't let that happen. The directness of his statement seemed to shock Morrison, who had clearly expected the usual royal response of duty above all else. The older man cleared his throat and consulted his notes again. Perhaps we could arrange for a lighter schedule? Fewer public appearances, more private time between engagements. It was a compromise that showed he fundamentally misunderstood the problem. This wasn't about having more time. It was about having the freedom to exist without constant performance. Catherine finally spoke, her voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside her. I need complete freedom from royal duties for an undetermined period. No half measures, no compromises, no gradual reduction. I need to step away entirely until I can figure out how to come back as myself rather than as a character I've been playing. The silence that followed was deafening. Morrison looked as if Catherine had suggested burning down Windsor Castle. In his world of carefully managed public image and rigid protocol, what she was proposing was nothing short of revolutionary. The media will have a field day, Morrison warned. There will be speculation about marriage troubles, mental health issues, family conflicts. The Republican movement will use this as ammunition against the monarchy itself. Each concern was valid, but they all missed the fundamental point that Catherine's well-being mattered more than public perception. William leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone he reserved for truly important moments. Let me be very clear about something. My wife's health and happiness are not negotiable. Our children's right to have parents who are genuinely present in their lives is not up for debate. If the institution cannot accommodate these basic human needs, then perhaps the institution needs to change. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Morrison had served the royal family for 15 years, and he had never heard a senior royal speak so directly about putting personal needs above duty. It was either the most refreshing thing he had witnessed or the most terrifying. Catherine felt a surge of love for her husband that reminded her why she had chosen to marry him in the first place. He was willing to challenge a 1,000-year-old institution for her. He was ready to face whatever consequences came from putting their family first. What exactly are you proposing? Morrison asked, and Catherine could hear the resignation in his voice. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't a request they were making. It was a decision they had already reached. We want to take the children and disappear for a while, Catherine explained. Somewhere private, somewhere we can be a family without cameras or commentary or constant analysis. I need to remember what my own voice sounds like when I'm not reading from a script. The idea of the future Queen of England simply disappearing was so foreign to Morrison that he struggled to process it. Where would you go? How would security be handled? What about the children's education? What about official responsibilities that specifically require your presence? William had anticipated these questions. We'll work out the practical details, but they're secondary to the primary goal. Catherine needs this, our children need this, and, frankly, I need this too. We've all been performing so long that I'm not sure any of us remember who we really are anymore. Morrison tried one more approach. Perhaps a brief holiday? A week or two away from London. We could arrange something private, minimal security presence, no official obligations. But, even as he spoke, he could see in their faces that a week or two wouldn't be enough. This wasn't about vacation. This was about survival. Catherine shook her head gently. I appreciate the attempt to find a middle ground, but there isn't one. I either step away completely, or I continue drowning slowly in a life that's supposed to be mine, but doesn't feel like it belongs to me at all. The meeting concluded with Morrison promising to discuss their request with senior palace officials, though they all knew that discussing was code for figuring out how to talk them out of it. William and Catherine left the meeting room hand in hand, both feeling lighter despite the storm they knew was coming. Word spread quickly through the palace corridors. By evening, Catherine's personal assistant had resigned rather than be part of what she called an unprecedented abandonment of duty. 2 senior advisors requested emergency meetings to discuss damage control strategies. The palace press office began preparing for questions they had never imagined having to answer. But, in their private apartment, William and Catherine felt something they hadn't experienced in months: hope. They sat together on the floor of George's room, helping him build a complicated castle, and for the first time in ages, Catherine's laughter was completely genuine. Are we really going to do this? She asked William later that night as they lay in bed, the moonlight streaming through their windows. The question carried the weight of everything they would be giving up and everything they might gain. We're not just going to do it, William replied, pulling her closer. We're going to do it in a way that shows our children what it means to choose love and authenticity over fear and expectation. Outside their window, London continued its restless pace, unaware that the future king and queen were planning a revolution that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with reclaiming their humanity. The next morning, Catherine woke up before dawn and stood at the window, watching the city wake up. For the first time in months, she felt excited about the future rather than trapped by it. The woman who had been slowly disappearing was beginning to find her way back. Tomorrow, they would begin making the practical arrangements that would allow them to step away from the only life they had known as adults. Tonight, they would hold each other and dream about what it might feel like to be free. The morning of their departure dawned gray and misty, as if the weather itself understood the weight of what was happening. Catherine stood in her dressing room, packing the last of her personal items into a simple suitcase. Her hands lingered over the formal gowns and designer shoes that had become her uniform, but she left them hanging in the wardrobe like costumes from a play she was no longer willing to perform. Instead, she packed jeans, comfortable sweaters, and the worn boots she used to wear for walks in the countryside before every step became a photo opportunity. Each casual item felt like a small act of rebellion against the woman she had been forced to become. The children moved through the apartment with unusual quiet, sensing that something important was happening even if they didn't fully understand what. George carefully packed his favorite books, while Charlotte insisted on bringing her collection of smooth stones she had gathered from various beaches during rare private holidays. Louis clutched his stuffed elephant, the one comfort item he refused to travel without. William coordinated with their minimal security team, explaining routes and safe houses that would allow them to disappear without completely abandoning their protection. Even in seeking freedom, they couldn't escape entirely from who they were and the responsibilities that came with their positions. The palace staff moved around them like ghosts, uncertain how to behave in the face of something that had never happened before. The maids who usually fussed over Catherine's appearance stood back awkwardly, unsure whether to help or pretend they weren't witnessing history being made. At 10 o'clock, they gathered in the main hallway for what everyone understood would be their final moment as residents of their official home. The children clustered around their parents, and Catherine felt a profound sense of rightness that had been missing from her life for months. Are you ready for our adventure? William asked the children, though his eyes were on Catherine. She nodded, feeling more certain about this decision than she had felt about anything in years. They were walking away from security and certainty, but they were walking toward themselves. The car journey to their departure point was silent except for the children's whispered conversations about what their new temporary home might look like. Catherine stared out the window at the London streets she knew so well, wondering when she would see them again and whether she would return as the same person who was leaving. Their destination was a cottage in the Scottish Highlands that belonged to a friend of William's family, someone who understood the value of privacy and had offered his property without questions or conditions. It was remote enough to provide the isolation Catherine craved, but comfortable enough to serve as a real home for their children. As they reached the private airfield, Catherine felt a moment of panic. What if she was making a terrible mistake? What if stepping away from royal life meant losing her identity entirely? What if the woman she was trying to rediscover no longer existed? William seemed to sense her sudden uncertainty. He reached for her hand and squeezed gently. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "we face it together." That's what marriage really means, not the public ceremonies or official duties, but choosing each other every day, especially when it's difficult. The small plane that would take them north sat waiting on the tarmac, modest and unmarked. No press had been alerted to their departure. No official statements had been prepared. For the first time in years, they were leaving without fanfare or documentation. As they walked across the tarmac, Catherine felt the weight of her former life falling away with each step. The woman who measured every gesture and calculated every smile was being left behind on the ground. The woman who climbed into that plane was someone who had chosen uncertainty over suffocation, authenticity over approval. George looked back at the car they had left behind and asked, "When are we coming back?" It was the question that had been haunting all of them, the one they couldn't answer because the truth was that they didn't know. "When we're ready," Catherine replied, and the simplicity of the answer felt revolutionary. For so long, their schedules had been determined by others, their choices made by committees, their lives planned years in advance. Now they were operating on their own timeline, making decisions based on their own needs. The plane taxied down the runway, and Catherine watched London shrink beneath them. With each mile, she felt lighter, as if she were literally rising above the life that had been weighing her down. The children pressed their faces to the windows, excited by the adventure even if they didn't understand its significance. As they flew north, Catherine allowed herself to imagine what the coming weeks might hold. Mornings without scheduled appearances, evenings without briefing papers, conversations that weren't carefully monitored for potential misstatements. The possibility of spontaneous laughter, unguarded moments, and the simple pleasure of being present in her own life. The Scottish landscape spread out below them like a promise of freedom. Rolling hills and ancient forests stretched to the horizon, unmarked by the formality and restriction of palace life. This was where they would rediscover who they were when stripped of titles and obligations. William reached across the aisle and took her hand. "No regrets?" he asked, and Catherine smiled, the first completely unguarded smile she had managed in months. "None," she said, and meant it completely. They were flying toward uncertainty, but they were flying together, and that made all the difference. As the plane began its descent toward the small airfield near their temporary home, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about what tomorrow might bring. For the first time since she had become a public figure, the future was unwritten, unscheduled, and entirely their own. The wheels touched down on Scottish soil, and Catherine, William, and their children stepped out into a new chapter of their lives. The Highland air was clean and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. Behind them, their former life continued without pause. Ahead of them lay the chance to remember who they really were. In the distance, their temporary home waited, a simple stone cottage that would shelter them while they rebuilt themselves from the inside out. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was theirs, and for now, that was everything. The silent moment of their departure had already begun to ripple outward, though they wouldn't learn about the media storm for several days. In this moment, surrounded by Highland silence and holding their children close, William and Catherine felt nothing but relief and the tentative beginning of hope. 3 months later, Catherine stood in the kitchen of the Highland cottage, flower in her hair and laughter on her lips as she attempted to teach Charlotte how to make proper scones. The scene would have been impossible to imagine during her palace days. The future Queen of England, covered in baking ingredients, completely absorbed in the simple pleasure of spending time with her daughter. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first few weeks had been difficult as they all adjusted to life without structure, without staff, without the constant presence of obligation. The children had struggled initially with the absence of their usual routines and teachers. William had found himself restless without the familiar rhythm of official duties. Catherine had faced moments of complete panic, wondering if she had destroyed her life by walking away from everything she had worked to build. But, slowly, like flowers growing through concrete, their authentic selves had begun to emerge. George discovered a passion for astronomy during the long Highland nights, spending hours with William learning to identify constellations they could never see through London's light pollution. Charlotte revealed a fierce independence, organizing elaborate adventure games for her younger brother and showing a natural leadership that reminded Catherine of her own childhood. Louis, freed from the constant presence of nannies and protocol officers, had blossomed into the mischievous, affectionate child he had always been underneath the careful behavior required at palace events. His laughter echoed through the cottage daily, a sound that filled Catherine's heart in ways she had forgotten were possible. "Mummy, I think I put too much cream," Charlotte said, holding up her hands which were covered in a mixture that bore only a passing resemblance to scone dough. Catherine looked at her daughter's creation and burst into genuine laughter, not the careful, measured response she had perfected for public appearances, but the uncontrolled giggle of a woman who had rediscovered joy in small moments. "Sometimes the best scones come from complete disasters," Catherine replied, helping Charlotte salvage her mixture. "Your great-grandmother taught me that the secret ingredient is always love, even if the measurements are completely wrong." These were the conversations Catherine had been longing for, natural exchanges with her children that weren't constrained by time limits or the presence of others. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing thoughts and dreams without the weight of public scrutiny hanging over every word. William found them in the kitchen as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. He had been chopping wood for their fireplace, a task he had insisted on learning despite the fact that they had perfectly adequate central heating. There was something therapeutic about the physical work, the simple cause and effective effort producing results. "How are my master bakers doing?" he asked, wrapping his arms around Catherine from behind. She leaned into his embrace, marveling at how natural affection had become again. During their palace years, even private moments had felt performed, as if they were always aware of being observed and judged. "We're creating masterpieces," Catherine replied, gesturing to the kitchen table covered in various states of baking chaos. "Charlotte is revolutionizing traditional spoon-making with her avant-garde approach to ingredient measurement." The easy banter between them was something they had fought to reclaim. In the early days of their retreat, they had discovered that they had almost forgotten how to talk to each other as people rather than as partners in a complex professional arrangement. It had taken weeks of awkward conversations and rediscovered intimacy to find their way back to the couple they had been before duty consumed their relationship. Evening came early in the Highlands, and they gathered around the fireplace as they did every night, reading together or playing board games that often dissolved into cheerful arguments about rules and fair play. These were the moments Catherine treasured most, when they were simply a family enjoying each other's company without agenda or schedule. "Tell us the story about when you and Daddy met," Louis requested, snuggling closer to Catherine on the sofa. It was a story the children had heard countless times, but, in this new context, Catherine found herself telling it differently, focusing on the genuine feelings and awkward moments rather than the sanitized version she had learned to share in interviews. "Your father was terrible at history," she began, and William made an exaggerated sound of protest that sent the children into giggles. "He used to borrow my notes, and then pretend he understood everything when our professor called on him. I was strategically utilizing available resources." William defended himself with mock dignity. "That's what future kings do, we delegate." These stories, told by firelight with no cameras or reporters present, became the foundation of their family mythology. The children learned about their parents as young people who made mistakes, had adventures, and fell in love in ordinary ways despite their extraordinary circumstances. As winter deepened, they established new traditions. Saturday mornings were for hiking the hills around their cottage, regardless of weather. Sunday afternoons were for board games that could stretch for hours. Wednesday evenings were for cooking experiments that often ended in ordering takeaway from the nearest village when their culinary ambitions exceeded their abilities. Catherine began keeping a journal during the long Highland evenings, trying to capture the process of rediscovering herself. The woman who emerged from those pages was someone she recognized but hadn't seen in years. Curious, spontaneous, occasionally silly, deeply thoughtful, and unafraid to express opinions that might be unpopular. "I think," she told William one night as they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed. I had started to believe that being authentic meant being selfish. That if I wanted things for myself, I was somehow failing everyone else. William nodded, understanding completely. We both lost ourselves in trying to be perfect for everyone else. But perfect isn't what our children need from us. They need us to be real. The revelation was simple but profound. Their children didn't need parents who never made mistakes or always said the right thing. They needed parents who were fully present, genuinely engaged, and willing to prioritize relationship over image. News from the outside world filtered in occasionally through carefully managed communication with the palace. The media had indeed had a field day with their disappearance, exactly as predicted. Speculation ranged from marriage crisis to mental health breakdown to secret royal protocol violations. But somehow, insulated by Highland silence and family love, the external drama felt like noise from another planet. Do you miss it? Charlotte asked one day as they walked through the village, anonymous in their hiking boots and weather-worn jackets. It was a perceptive question from a 9-year-old who was old enough to understand what they had left behind. Catherine considered the question seriously. I miss some of the people, she replied honestly. I miss feeling useful in some of the work we did. But I don't miss feeling like I was always performing instead of living. Spring arrived in the Highlands with dramatic beauty, transforming their landscape from austere winter beauty to vibrant green abundance. The longer days brought new energy to their family routines, and a growing sense that their time of retreat was beginning to naturally evolve towards something new. They weren't the same people who had left London months earlier. Catherine moved through the world with a confidence that came from knowing herself rather than from playing a role. William had rediscovered the humor and spontaneity that had attracted Catherine to him in university. The children had experienced what it meant to be the center of their parents' attention without competition from official duties. As they sat together on the hillside behind their cottage, watching the sunset paint the Highland sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Catherine felt a deep sense of completeness. This wasn't the end of their story. Eventually they would return to public life, but they would return as people who had remembered who they really were. Whatever happens next, William said, echoing her thoughts, we've learned something important. We've learned that we can choose each other over everything else, and that choice makes us stronger, not weaker. Catherine smiled, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. They had found their way back to each other and to themselves. The silent goodbye that had shocked the world had led them to the most authentic happiness they had ever known. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight, they were simply a family, completely present in a moment that belonged entirely to them.